Okay, so recently I finished reading Midnight Tides by Steven Erikson, which is book 5 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. And I'm going to do a quick, or not so quick, spoiler-ridden review. There's going to be spoilers all throughout, so if you're not looking for spoilers, click off the video now. I want to talk about a bunch of different details from the book. In short, I really enjoyed this book. Something about the way that Steven Erikson writes, it just strikes home with me. I was talking about this to one of my friends who has also been reading these books at a similar pace to me. Something we were discussing is that Steven Erikson finds a way to discuss essential truths about the world and reality, philosophy, love, money, power. He writes about these essential truths about all of these things, and then infuses those truths into a fantasy story. And I think the way that he does that makes it so addicting. Like, kind of once you figure that out, that's the thing that I'm looking for as I'm continuously reading. Like right now I'm 800 pages into Bonehunters, which is the 6th book. I don't know, I can't get enough. So without further ado, let's begin the review. I'm gonna try not to make it too long. So at the end of book 4, House of Chains, we have two characters, Onrak, who is a Talana Mouse, and Trull Sengar, who is a Tisti Eater. There are some other Talana Mouse characters, but I can't remember their names right now. But they're all in a cave or room or throne room, something like that, to defend the throne of Shadow from an imminent attack. Throughout the whole book, Onrak has been trying to ask Trull Sengar to give him his backstory. There's little to no explanation about where Trull Sengar is from, how he became the person he is in House of Chains. Throughout the book, Onrak is kind of giving his story to Trull, and Trull's hearing him out and being kind of this empathetic friend for Onrak. And so finally at the end of House of Chains, Onrak is kind of having this sentimental moment with Trull, and he asks again, why don't you finally tell me the story of your life? Trull finally agrees to tell the story, and then boom, House of Chains ends. And so I thought it was fitting that once you get past the prologue of Midnight Tides, you realize that the whole book is essentially about Trull's backstory. It's about Trull's people and his family and the conflicts that led him to where he is in the present day Malazan storyline. So anyway, I just thought that was a fascinating little way to stitch the two books together. And again, it was kind of like, it reminded me of the beginning of House of Chains, where we're following Karsa for 250 pages straight. As you start Midnight Tides, you realize, hey, we're not jumping back and forth in time anymore. We're not going to go back to the main storyline. We're just going to be, thousands of years in the future with the Tisti Eater and their conflict with this other empire on the continent of Lether. So yeah, once I realized that, I was like, okay, now I'm in it. I get where the context of the story was, because I will admit it took a little bit of time at the beginning of Midnight Tides to get into to get connected to the Tisti Eater and the continent of Lether, and to reacclimate yourself with all of these new characters, because there weren't many familiar faces other than Trull. But like I said, once you get 100 pages in and the momentum starts to get going, it just became immensely satisfying. All right, so to briefly go over the main conflict in Midnight Tides is you have the Tisti Eater, who are this very honor-bound tribal society. They live in a forest. They live off the land. They have slaves, but they don't have a monetary system. There's no system of debt. They just barter with each other. And then on the opposing side, you have the 𝒂𝒊𝒏 Empire. There's no other way to describe the 𝒂𝒊𝒏 Empire other than saying that they live in a capitalistic society. At least that's how I saw it. I saw that Erikson was making an analogy to capitalism through the way that he was describing the 𝒂𝒊𝒏 Empire. I think you could also draw an analogy to any other massive empire throughout history. It doesn't have to necessarily be America. It could be a Roman Empire, Chinese Empire, Japanese Empire, the British Empire, etc. Essentially, what he's drawing an allusion to colonialism. That's how the 𝒂𝒊𝒏 Empire sustains itself, as it takes resources from other people and other places and takes it as their own, and then uses it to grow their power and influence. So I guess just to wrap up that point, you have these two very different societies, and the book, one of the main themes of the book is how do, what kind of cultural conflicts are you going to find between societies that are like this, especially when they live in close proximity to each other. So just to wrap up my point about the two different societies is that I think the book is talking about the cultural differences between these different ways of living, and how when you have societies that live so differently, how that might instigate conflict between them. And it also kind of draws some questions is like, what are the pros and cons of each one? Are there good things about the 𝑦𝒐𝒏 Empire? Are there, there's plenty of bad things about the 𝑦𝒐𝒏 Empire, but are there good things as well? Same thing goes for the 𝑡𝑖𝑠𝑡𝑖 Eaters. There was another main theme of brotherhood throughout the entire book. You have two groups of brothers that are main characters in the novel. You have the Sengar brothers, who are on the 𝑡𝑖𝑠𝒐𝒐 Eater side of the novel. That would be Fear, Trull, Rhulad, and Benatus. And then on the 𝑦𝒐𝒏 side of the novel, you're going to have the Beddict brothers, which would be Brys, Tehol, and Hull. I felt that they had very different connections throughout the book. The Sengar brothers seem to be much tighter to me. That's how I interpreted it. They're definitely in competition with each other. They were jostling for position, looking to step up in the hierarchy of the family. But at the same time, they were always looking out for one another. That was one thing that I picked up on, is even in moments where there might have been a sense of competition, at the end of the day, if one of them had to take a step down and let another one rise to power, they would do that for the betterment of the entire family and for the 𝑡𝑖𝑠𝒐𝒐 Eater. On the other side, you have the Beddict brothers, and they just weren't as connected, in my opinion. They seem to be kind of blown apart from each other. There was talk of some sort of tragedy that happened to their parents in the past. I was wondering if Erikson was trying to show that how, if the head of the family is destroyed in one way or another, we never get an explanation for why their parents aren't around in the book. If the parents aren't around, then that might lead to a much more disconnected family down the line, and that's what we see in the book. The three Beddict brothers have very different storylines from each other. Brys is the champion of the king. Essentially, his duty is to protect the king's life. Tehol is in the city of Lethras, and he's just essentially this manic genius who is constantly concocting different schemes and plots that nobody seems to understand but himself. And then you have Hull Beddict, who is this very honorable, duty-bound character who essentially worked his life away for the 𝑦𝒐𝒏 Empire, but then as he was doing that, he realized that what he was doing was just leading to the destruction of the indigenous people who lived around the 𝑦𝒐𝒏 Empire. And so he kind of falls into this pit of despair, emotional despair, and then eventually betrays the 𝑦𝒐𝒏 Empire and sides with the 𝑡𝑖𝑠𝒐𝒐 Eater. It was all very dramatic, but it was, the way it plays out it's just interesting and very sad. But like I said, you don't get a lot of connection between these three brothers. I think Brys and Tehol maybe talk to each other once or twice in the whole book. Hull Beddict doesn't get back to the city of Lethras until the very end, and it's a devastating ending, to say the least. So yeah, I loved both of these families. I found it interesting to look at the differences between the two of them. Before we get too far along, we have to talk about the prologue, because I felt like it was an incredibly important part of the book and delivered some very crucial information for the series overall. So when the book starts off, it's just pure chaos. You're thrown into this massive battle with, I forget the exact numbers, but there's hundreds of thousands of 𝑡𝑖𝑠𝒐𝒐 Eater and 𝑡𝑖𝑠𝒐𝒐 Andy who are fighting the 𝑧𝒐𝒏𝒌𝒔 Mael in this epic battle with sky castles and dragons and the soul-taken dragons, Essentially, the way Erikson describes it, it's just like a pure chaos. The way that Erikson describes it, it's just pure anarchy. There's fires, basically sky keeps falling out of the sky, flaming, crashing on the ground, dragons fighting each other, 𝑧𝒐𝒏𝒌𝒔 Mael being slaughtered by the thousands. It's nuts. It's absurd. And especially once you have these races and these people have been built up so much in the other books. It's like in Gardens of the Moon, you only get a couple 𝑡𝑠𝑡𝑖 and the way that Erikson makes them feel in that book is that you feel like these are just such powerful individuals. And then in this prologue, there's like 400,000 𝑡𝑠𝑡𝑖 or whatever. You're like, oh, I didn't realize that there's not just like a couple hundred of these characters. There's, an entire race that is this powerful, this magically enhanced. It's just epic on a whole nother scale. And it's just a great way to get you drawn in at the beginning of the book. But one thing I noticed right away in this prologue is that the 𝑡𝑠𝑡𝑖 and 𝑡𝑠𝑡𝑖 are working together, which was not the case at all in the present day Malazan storyline, where they were in conflict with one another. So immediately that made me think, okay, what's the deal? Why are they in this alliance? What's changed between present day and then? Well, you find out in the prologue, because as the prologue continues on, once the battle is over, Silchus Ruin, who is a soul-taken 𝑡𝑠𝑡𝑖, meets with Skabendari Blood-Eye, who is a soul-taken 𝑡𝑠𝑡𝑖. They meet on the battlefield. As things are starting to wrap up, it looks like they've won. And in the midst of that conversation, Skabendari betrays Silchus and stabs him in the back, and the battle just like renews. And now it's the 𝑡𝑠𝑡𝑖 versus the 𝑡𝑠𝑡𝑖, and just chaos keeps going on. That was kind of an eye-opening moment, because it's like, oh, now we know why there's this giant conflict between shadow and darkness, and potentially why the realm of shadow is in its current state in the books. I don't know exactly why that is, but now there's an inkling like, oh, there was this massive betrayal at some point down the line, and clearly that's going to lead to more chaos, and I'm sure we'll figure out more information about that as the books go on. Another thing that I thought was interesting about the prologue is that we're introduced to Mael for the first time, which is an elder god of the sea. And Mael has an interaction with Gothos, who is a 𝒂💑, who we've seen in previous books. Gothos is in the middle of like casting this giant spell over the whole battlefield. He just kind of, the sense that I got is that he's going to just freeze the entire battlefield in place. No pun intended, tell everybody to chill out. And Mael stops him midway through that spell and says, hey, let's do this another way. Let's make a deal with another elder god. And yeah, I just thought that was a cool interaction. And then it sets up the rest of the book, because Mael becomes exponentially more important the farther you get into Midnight Tides. So Mael will definitely be a character to look out for in the following books based on what I learned in Midnight Tides. But also it opens up some questions about Gothos, because I'm still not entirely sure how powerful he is. And at some point, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Gothos, the first time we meet Gothos is in one of the 𝑎𝒂𝒊𝒏 houses, and where he is a servant of some kind to the 𝑎𝒂𝒊𝒏. And I also believe Gothos is Icarium's father. It's like the stage is set for him to have a very important role later on in the books. Who's to say what that will be? Moving forward. This is a major spoiler, so, if you've been listening and you really don't want spoilers, click off now. I'm going to just say that again, because some people in the comments have said, oh my god, you talk about spoilers. I'm like, yes, didn't I say that at the beginning of the video? Anyway, spoiler. Since we just talked about Mael, let's talk about Tehol and Bugg. And if you've read the whole book, you know why there's a connection between these characters. I just found that the reveal of Bugg being Mael at the end of the book was such a, mind-blowing event. I mean, I knew there was going to be some, massive revelation about Bugg, because clearly Bugg was doing way more than we were led to believe at the beginning of the book. Like, by the second half of the book, you're like, okay, this guy is clearly incredibly capable on his own. And at some point I was like, okay, maybe he's just a high mage character, or or a demon, or some other character with magic ability. But the revelation at the end that he was an elder god, I was like, Jesus. I don't know. It was an incredibly satisfying revelation, but it also didn't really take away from the rest of the book, where he was just playing along as the normal manservant, which I also thoroughly enjoyed. Like, the whole time where I thought he was just kind of a mindless character doing Tehol's bidding, I was totally happy with that storyline as well. I was cracking up. I don't know. Personally, I find Erikson writes humor in a way that connects with me. It's very I don't know, it's very clever and dry, I think, at times. You know, the whole first half of the book, they had me cracking up anytime there was a discussion about some like absurdly insane thing that they were going to eat that Bugg had dragged off of the street, like literally off of the street or out of the trash for him to like boil in water and then feed to Tehol, and Tehol would be like, yeah, no problem. I'll eat that. I don't know. I thought it's very weird, but I found it incredibly humorous, especially the way it was laid out in the book. They just kind of have a buddy cop feel, like partners in crime kind of feel. And I felt like the storyline with Tehol and Bugg really added some levity to a very depressing, tragic book. Anytime the storyline would switch back to them, be like, okay, here's going to be a nice little break from the torture, destruction, and death that is going on in the rest of the novel. The fact that that storyline was so happy and like kind of free of the chaos and the free of the suffering and all that, it made the end way more wild when Tehol gets like beaten to a pulp by the Tista Eater. I believe it's by the Tista Eater. And Beddict also gets killed by the Narek in that same scene. It's like Beddict essentially is running to meet up with Tehol, and he wants to kind of like convince him of his point of view. But he rounds a corner, and then he sees Tehol getting beaten to death, kicked and punched to death, which, by the way, Erikson describes in the most visceral manner. Reading that, I remember reading that page and thinking, wow, this is like beautiful writing, but also incredibly disturbing. And so Hull witnesses his brother being beaten to death, and then he proceeds to be stabbed to death. And there's this moment where you're like, what? Is everybody dead now? But Mael, or who we don't realize is Mael just yet, but Bugg walks into the alleyway afterwards, and I think it's the first time where you see Bugg be upset. And I think the fact that the rest of the book you don't see any inkling of him being upset at all makes this scene where he comes across Tehol's body so much more impactful. Yeah, like I'm getting like goosebumps just thinking about reading that scene again. Fantastic. Just a great storyline. Anyway, moving on. So probably the most tragic storyline in the whole book is Rhulad's storyline. Rhulad is the youngest brother of the Sengar brothers, and when the book starts, he's a rather annoying character who's constantly trying to prove himself to the rest of the family. He's doing kind of weird nonsense, like hitting on Fear's wife. Fear is his oldest brother. There's some sort of like weird romance story going on between Mayen, who is Fear's wife, and Rhulad. People just seem to let it go for some reason at the beginning of the book. And Rhulad has never been to combat, so he's constantly trying to like prove himself in sparring sessions and all this different nonsense. But he, you know, overall, he just gives off a very much a younger brother vibe, you know, somebody who's wants to be part of the gang, essentially. But the gang just so happens to be a bunch of Tista Eater warriors, not your standard family. I'm assuming everybody who's watching this knows that eventually the Sengar brothers are sent on this quest to retrieve a magical item, and they finally reach the magical item, and it turns out to be a magic sword. But when they go to retrieve it, they're attacked by the 𝒂𝒊𝒏, which are a race of soul-taken wolf people, something like that. And the 𝒂𝒊𝒏 attack them, and so they're engaged in combat, and during that combat, Rhulad loses his weapon, so he reaches down and picks up the sword and then proceeds to use that sword to kill several of the 𝒂𝒏 before getting himself killed. And this is where, you know, the turmoil really begins for the Tista Eater. At first, it's just the trauma for the Sengar brothers of, hey, our brother just died. But as they inspect Rhulad's corpse further, they realize that the sword is now embedded in Rhulad's hand. They can't remove the sword from Rhulad's grip. So at that point in time, they just say, hey, okay, we'll deal with this when we get back to the Tista Eater camp. And so they pack up Rhulad's body and drag him all the way back to the Warlock King and to their family. When they finally get Rhulad's body back to the Tista Eater camp, Rhulad's body is supposed to go through this special process that all of the Tista Eater go through when they die. And that involves hot wax being dripped on the body and then gold coins being embedded into that body's skin. And Rhulad's body happens to be treated by one of the Sengar slaves, this character 𝒂𝒏𝒏, who turns out to be pivotal. And Rhulad's body is being treated by this character 𝒂𝒏𝒏, who is a slave of the Sengar family. And he is a key player in the entire book. I don't have enough time to get into his whole storyline right now, but he plays a pivotal role throughout the whole novel. And so 𝒂𝒏𝒏 is embedding these gold coins into the wax skin of Rhulad's body, and then all of a sudden Rhulad wakes up in pure agony, his body covered in gold coins, this sword embedded in his hand. It's just this massive shock to 𝒂𝒏𝒏, who like was literally treating a dead body, and next thing you know, he's dealing with a person who's alive and in pure pain. And so it turns out that when Rhulad died, he was visited by the crippled god, and there was a negotiation. Essentially, the crippled god says, hey, I'm going to give you power. I'm going to give you everything that you've been looking for, the ability to take anything you've ever wanted for yourself. In return, you're going to serve me. And so Rhulad goes through with that pact. And so, when he finally returns to his body, he's now a servant of the crippled god, but nobody else knows that but himself. And now he has this strange power where if he dies, he can return to life. But that doesn't mean that the process of returning to life is completely painless, as we see in this first rebirth. It's clearly filled with agony. So obviously this causes great turmoil for the Tiste Eater as a whole. But if we're just gonna let's just focus on Rhulad for this moment in time. I'm assuming everybody here's read the book, so you know where this goes. Rhulad's given everything he's ever wanted and everything that he's striving for at the beginning of the book. He's given honor, a role within the Tiste Eater. He's put at the head of the family. Essentially, he's become more powerful than his brothers, more powerful than even his father. But all of this comes at great cost. Every time he dies and then is reborn, it feels like his character becomes more insane. You're slowly watching his psyche dissolve over time. And it's just a horrible thing to read, honestly. Like, you're just, watching somebody slowly become more and more mentally unwell. There's one particular scene that I distinctly remember, and it involves 𝒂𝒏𝒏𝒏. It's the two of them alone, and they're standing in Rhulad's chambers. They're having a conversation about what Rhulad's going to do next with the Tiste Eater's campaign to conquer the 𝑨𝒏𝒊𝒏 Empire. But really, it's just Rhulad kind of trying to connect with 𝒂𝒏𝒏𝒏, and he's using 𝒂𝒏𝒏𝒏 as his therapist, basically. And it's at that point in time that you kind of realize that these are two characters with very different power levels. One is an emperor, one is a slave, but they're both going through a very similar experience. They're both bound to somebody above them. As free as Rhulad might seem with all of his power and ambition, he's still a slave. He's still bound to somebody. With 𝒂𝒏𝒏𝒏, it's much more visible and concrete that yes, he's a slave. It's the first time in the book where you kind of see them on the same playing field to some respect. And there's almost this understanding that since 𝒂𝒏𝒏𝒏 has experience being a slave, there's some amount of, he can kind of console Rhulad as he comes to terms with his own situation. It's a very tragic scene, but also kind of a very beautiful scene at the same time. These were all the main points that I just wanted to harp on from the book. I'm going to quickly go through a couple of honorable mentions that I thought were pretty sweet. This character Ironbars that we get 3/4 of the way through the book, who's a member of the Crimson Guard. What a fucking badass. This character is so sick. Every once in a while, Erikson includes, not every once in a while, there's plenty of these kind of characters throughout the book, I feel like. Just characters that are entirely overpowered and for seemingly, well, I'm sure there's a reason. There's definitely a reason, but in this book, I just was so surprised. At least in the circumstances in which Ironbars appears, I had no idea he was going to be this powerful. That's the best way I can explain it. And it also makes me think more about the Crimson Guard, who I know we've seen in the previous books, but maybe I just didn't read enough about them or get enough information to realize that the warriors in the Crimson Guard were this OP. What the hell is going on? The first scene where Ironbars fights Rhulad and kills him for the first time, I thought that was going to go a totally different direction. Ironbars just slays all of his guards, and then I think he just snaps Rhulad's neck or something. I don't know. The way it was written was incredible. but I'm hoping that there's going to be plenty more iron bars in the books. He's just he's like the Punisher. I don't know. Maybe that's not a good way to describe it, but that's how it felt. Okay, another good scene was the Forkrul Assail that escapes its barrow and then has this brief fight with the Tista Eater demons. There's been more information about the Forkrul Assail in the books. They're definitely getting a little bit more of a presence so far, so it's making me think that, hey, we're going to see more Forkrul Assail in the books to come, and this little fight skirmish that happens was a nice taste of that. But at the same time, I felt like it still wasn't enough. Like I still don't know who this race of people are and what their role is in the greater scheme of the Malazan storyline. But Erikson is definitely building them up slowly over time to play a part in the near future. So we'll see where it goes. I'm curious. When Brys Beddict goes to Mael's realm, which is in the sea, and fights Mael's guardian, that was a very interesting scene. The fact that that guardian is protecting all of these unnamed elder gods who have essentially lost worshippers. That's something that I've now learned over the course of reading the books, is that the way that these gods gain power is by being worshipped, right? So the more worshippers they have, the more power they have throughout the books. It seems like gods are falling in and out of power, right? And so it seems like Mael has taken a bunch of the gods that have fallen out of power and he's saving them from dying. That's what I got out of it. He's keeping them from totally passing away into nothingness. And this guardian was there, to prevent them from being taken away. So I thought that was a really interesting scene, and I'm sure that's going to give more context. I'm sure that's going to come back around later in the books. So I just finished editing the review that you're currently watching. Clearly, it's a different point in time than when I recorded that review. I never did a proper outro, so here it is. There was a lot more I wanted to discuss in regards to Midnight Tides, but I had to cut it off somewhere. If you liked the review, please like the channel and subscribe. If you have any thoughts about what I discussed in the video, drop a comment down below. I'm already partway through Reaper's Gale at this point, so the Bonehunters video should be coming soon, and I will see everybody in the next review. Thanks for watching.